Imagine growing up without ever knowing what love feels like. It's hard to fathom, right? But what if I told you that one of the most infamous characters in literature, Voldemort, was once that child? A child who never received love, never understood what it truly meant to care for someone, and was shaped by the absence of it in his life. It's easy to see Voldemort as a monster, a villain with no redeeming qualities. But when we dig deeper, we uncover a story of profound loneliness and heartbreak. As a young boy, Tom Riddle, later known as Voldemort, was deprived of the most basic human need, love. This lack of love wasn't just an absence, it was a void that consumed him, turning him into the ruthless dark wizard we all fear. His trauma began with rejection from his parents, abandonment by his mother, and the harsh realities of growing up in an orphanage. These early experiences set the stage for a life filled with pain, distrust, and a thirst for power. No one in his life ever showed him what love looked like. His mother, Mara P. Gaunt, failed to give him affection or warmth, and his father, Tom Riddle Sr., had long abandoned the family. From the start, Voldemort's story is one of abandonment, and this trauma became the foundation for his dark path. Imagine, as a child, never feeling the safety or comfort of a loving embrace. Without that foundation, how would you view the world? How would you relate to others? For Voldemort, the absence of love created a gaping wound in his heart, one that would never heal. This wound fueled his actions and beliefs, shaping him into someone who could never trust, never connect, and never truly love. But what is a person without love? Can they find meaning in the world, or are they doomed to walk through life searching for something they will never truly understand? Voldemort, like many who face deep emotional scars, built a defense mechanism to protect himself. He developed an intense need for control, power, and fear. By making others fear him, he thought he could fill the emptiness inside him. But no matter how much power he gained, the void never left. He could never replace the love he was denied as a child, and in the end, that left him empty and broken. His inner conflict was rooted in a deep desire to be loved and accepted, but he could not allow himself to experience love, fearing it would make him weak. This internal battle raged throughout his life. Every time he confronted someone who embodied love and compassion, like Harry Potter, it triggered his greatest fears, that he was unworthy, unlovable, and doomed to a life of isolation. As Voldemort grew older, this trauma transformed into obsession. He became consumed with the idea of immortality, not just as a way to conquer death, but as a way to escape the loneliness that plagued him. In his quest for power, Voldemort never saw that the real enemy was not his mortality, but the love he had never learned to accept. As his journey continued, he reached a breakdown, a moment when he realized that all the power in the world couldn't fill the hole in his heart. But by then, it was too late. His obsession with control and dominance had already cost him his humanity. The consequence of Voldemort's journey was tragic. He became the very thing he feared the most, a man incapable of forming meaningful relationships, lost in a cycle of manipulation, violence, and fear. His lack of love left him with nothing but empty victories, a life filled with hollow achievements and an inability to connect with those around him. In the end, Voldemort's story is a warning: when we fail to address the wounds of our past, they define our future. His story, while dark, reminds us that love isn't just a luxury, it's a necessity for survival, for growth, and for our very humanity. If we, like Voldemort, ignore the need for love, we risk losing ourselves. So, let me ask you, what happens when we grow up without ever learning what love feels like? Can we ever truly heal, or are we destined to become shadows of who we could have been? Voldemort's greatest fear wasn't just death, it was the emotional vulnerability that comes with loving and being loved. This fear, born from childhood neglect and abandonment, fueled his deep hatred for anyone who could love freely. He couldn't understand love, nor could he allow himself to be open to it. As a result, he spent his life constructing walls so high that no one could ever break through. His obsession with power wasn't just about controlling others, it was a desperate attempt to protect himself from the one thing he feared most, the risk of emotional vulnerability. Power, for Voldemort, was a shield. It was the only thing he believed could protect him from the pain of ever being abandoned again. He rejected the idea that love was a necessity, viewing it as a weakness rather than a strength. Voldemort's refusal to embrace love ultimately became a self-fulfilling prophecy. He distanced himself from everyone, ensuring that the very love he feared would never come. This deep psychological wound left him trapped in a cycle of emotional isolation. He rejected any form of affection, pushing away those who showed him kindness, even though he desperately longed for it. His need for power grew as his need for connection with others diminished. It's a tragic irony that the more he sought to control his destiny, the more he lost control of his emotions. Voldemort's emotional defense mechanisms were deeply rooted in his trauma. His cold and calculating nature was a direct result of the fear that being vulnerable would make him weak. Instead of confronting his own insecurities, he chose to manipulate, dominate, and destroy anyone who stood in his way. The emotional walls he built were fortified with distrust and fear, and as they grew stronger, his ability to connect with others withered. The more he embraced his power, the more he detached from his humanity. His quest for immortality was driven not just by a fear of death, but by a need to escape from his vulnerability. Immortality, to him, was freedom from the emotional pain he couldn't endure. It was a way to avoid the one thing he feared most, the loss of control. But in his pursuit of eternal life, he lost his chance at redemption. His inability to embrace vulnerability led him to become a figure devoid of empathy. He was incapable of love, incapable of understanding the very thing that could have healed his emotional wounds. Instead of acknowledging the deep pain that stemmed from his childhood, Voldemort chose to bury it under layers of hatred and power. His emotional conflict was rooted in the tension between the desire for love and the need for control. He wanted to be loved but believed that love would make him weak. He wanted to feel connection but refused to open himself to it, fearing that doing so would lead to another betrayal. This internal battle became his downfall. The more he feared love, the more it controlled him. His breakdown came when he realized that, despite all his power, he was still alone. He had pushed away everyone who could have cared for him, and in doing so, he was left with nothing but his own emptiness. The consequence of Voldemort's refusal to confront his emotional trauma was the loss of his humanity. He became a shell of a person, someone capable of great power but incapable of feeling. His quest for dominance, his need to control everything and everyone, only isolated him further. In the end, Voldemort's story is a cautionary tale. It's a story about how fear and trauma can shape a person's life in ways that destroy them from the inside out. His inability to embrace love or vulnerability left him hollow, a man who gained everything but lost the most important thing, human connection. And so, I ask you, what happens when we refuse to face our deepest fears? Can we ever truly heal, or are we doomed to become like Voldemort, trapped by the very things we try to control? Voldemort's inner conflict was deeply tied to his unresolved needs, particularly the need for love and acceptance. From an early age, he was deprived of the most fundamental human connection, love. This lack of affection left a wound so deep that he could never fully heal. As a child, he experienced the profound pain of being abandoned by his mother, who failed to provide him with the warmth and security that a child so desperately needs. Instead of feeling safe and cared for, he was left in an orphanage, feeling isolated and alone. This early trauma created a psychological gap that Voldemort never could fill. As he grew older, this need for love turned into a craving for power. He couldn't understand what it meant to love, so he turned to controlling others as a way to compensate for the void inside him. Power became his substitute for love, something he could hold onto and control. But as much as he tried to fill the emptiness with power and fear, it never truly satisfied him. His growing obsession with control and domination was a defense mechanism, a way to shield himself from the vulnerability he feared. Voldemort's deep-seated need for control stemmed from the belief that without it, he would be just as powerless and vulnerable as he had been as a child. He couldn't allow himself to experience love or affection because to do so would mean exposing himself to the same kind of hurt he had faced when he was abandoned. The fear of vulnerability was so strong that it overshadowed his desire for connection. His internal battle was marked by a tension between his desire to love and his fear of being loved. He wanted to experience intimacy and human connection, but he couldn't bring himself to open up. The idea of being loved terrified him because it felt like a loss of control. He feared that letting someone in would leave him exposed, weak, and ultimately rejected. This was the paradox at the core of his being: the more he craved connection, the more he pushed it away. His emotional walls grew higher, keeping everyone at a distance. Even when he encountered people like Harry Potter, who represented love, acceptance, and compassion, he could not allow himself to acknowledge the value of these emotions. He saw Harry as a threat to his carefully constructed world of power and control. His fear of love made him reject those who cared about him, and he became increasingly isolated. Voldemort's inability to meet his basic emotional needs left him in a constant state of internal turmoil. He was trapped in a cycle of yearning for something he couldn't have: true emotional connection. The more he sought power and control, the less he understood love, and the more he distanced himself from humanity. His heart grew colder, and his actions more detached, as he convinced himself that power was the only thing worth pursuing. In the end, Voldemort's inner conflict was not just about his desire for power, it was about the deep, unmet need for love and connection that he could never allow himself to fully experience. His inability to reconcile his fear of vulnerability with his longing for love led him to a life of emotional isolation and, ultimately, to his own undoing. His story is a tragic reminder of how our deepest unmet needs can shape the course of our lives, trapping us in cycles of fear, pain, and loneliness. Voldemort's psychological turning point, the trigger that pushed him further into darkness, came when he realized that love was not just something he could control, but something that could destroy him if he allowed himself to experience it. This realization hit him when he first encountered Harry Potter. Harry, unlike Voldemort, embodied love, kindness, and empathy. Voldemort's reaction to Harry was complex. He was both intrigued and terrified. He saw Harry as a threat, not because of Harry's power, but because of what Harry represented, the very thing Voldemort had spent his entire life avoiding. For Voldemort, Harry's ability to love was incomprehensible. Voldemort had spent years building a fortress around himself, convincing himself that love was a weakness, something that would only lead to suffering and vulnerability. The idea that Harry, someone so young, could have such a strong connection with others, particularly with his friends and mentors, triggered Voldemort's deepest fear: his own inability to connect. It was a turning point because, for the first time, Voldemort was confronted with the very thing he had rejected and feared his entire life. Harry's presence forced him to acknowledge the emptiness that had taken root inside him. The trigger wasn't just Harry's power, it was his humanity, his ability to care for others, and to form meaningful bonds. Voldemort, who had spent his life conquering everything he could control, realized that there was one thing he could never conquer: the emotional connection that Harry had with others. This realization struck a deep chord within him, causing him to spiral further into his obsession with power. Voldemort couldn't understand why Harry was able to maintain such connections and love, despite the harshness of the world around him. This baffled Voldemort because he had been taught that love was a source of weakness. In Voldemort's eyes, love was a vulnerability that left him exposed, while Harry's ability to love seemed to make him stronger. This psychological trigger shifted Voldemort's mindset. He became more determined than ever to sever any chance of experiencing love or kindness. The more he saw of Harry, the more it reinforced Voldemort's belief that love was something that could either make him weak or destroy him completely. This fear, combined with his obsession with control, pushed him further down the path of isolation. Voldemort's need to destroy Harry was no longer just about conquering a potential threat, it was about erasing the reminder that love, something he could never possess, could be more powerful than any form of control or domination. The turning point triggered a deeper emotional breakdown, and Voldemort's increasing obsession with power became his way of coping with the fear of love and connection. His encounter with Harry Potter forced him to confront the pain of his own emotional inadequacies, and he reacted by pushing love further away, cementing his path toward becoming the very thing he feared. Voldemort's rejection of love ultimately led to his undoing, but this moment marked the point where he chose fear and power over vulnerability and connection, sealing his fate as a man who would forever be alone. Voldemort's psychological collapse was both gradual and inevitable. As he continued down his path of power, he became increasingly aware that his quest for control was not fulfilling him. The emptiness inside him, the result of his inability to experience love, was becoming too overwhelming to ignore. Despite all his power, his achievements, and the fear he instilled in others, Voldemort could not escape the fundamental truth that he was alone. The more he isolated himself, the more he distanced himself from humanity, and the more he clung to his belief that love was a weakness, the more his mental state deteriorated. His rejection of love wasn't just an emotional stance, it was a defense mechanism, a way to protect himself from the pain of vulnerability. But as time passed, the walls he had built around his heart only became prisons. His interactions with others were purely transactional, based on fear and control, never compassion or connection. This made him more paranoid, more disconnected, and, ultimately, more fragile. His obsession with power turned into a desperate need to prove that he was invincible, that he could remain untouchable by the very things that caused him pain. However, this was also his greatest downfall. In his attempt to control everything around him, Voldemort found himself losing control over his own emotions and his ability to connect with others. He became increasingly erratic in his actions, unable to trust anyone, even his closest followers. His fixation on immortality, which was initially a way to escape death, transformed into a means of escape from his own fear of love and connection. Voldemort had come to believe that love was not only a weakness but also a threat to his existence. He feared that to allow himself to love or to be loved would expose him to a vulnerability that would ultimately destroy him. The more he ran from this vulnerability, the more he found himself spiraling into a state of confusion and emotional disarray. The breakdown came when Voldemort realized that no amount of power or immortality could shield him from the loneliness that plagued him. The very thing he feared the most, the ability to form deep emotional connections, was what he needed the most to heal. But by the time he reached this realization, it was too late. Voldemort had severed every possible bond, convinced himself that love was a curse, and surrounded himself with nothing but fear and control. His psychological collapse wasn't dramatic or sudden, it was a slow and steady erosion of everything that once gave him purpose. It was the collapse of his belief that power alone could save him. As Voldemort's grip on his emotions loosened, his once unshakable confidence began to crumble. The man who had once feared nothing and no one was now consumed by his own internal conflict. His desire for control had become his greatest prison, and in seeking to destroy the very thing he needed most, Voldemort had destroyed himself. His emotional breakdown was the culmination of years of rejecting love, rejecting vulnerability, and rejecting everything that made him human. In the end, Voldemort's collapse was not just the fall of a powerful dark wizard, it was the fall of a man who could not bear to face the emptiness within himself, who could not acknowledge the need for connection, and who ultimately found that no amount of power could save him from the devastation of his own mind. The long-term psychological consequences of Voldemort's actions were profound, shaping not only his destiny but also the lives of everyone around him. Throughout his life, Voldemort rejected the basic human need for love and connection, choosing instead to pursue power at any cost. This decision, rooted in his childhood trauma, left him emotionally stunted and disconnected from the world. The psychological damage he suffered from never experiencing love or acceptance created a void that no amount of power could fill. Over time, this void deepened, leading to an increasingly fractured sense of self. Voldemort's inability to form meaningful relationships meant that he had no one to turn to for support, understanding, or emotional grounding. His relationships with his followers were transactional, based solely on fear and control. He could never understand the true nature of loyalty or friendship because he had never known the warmth of genuine connection. This emotional detachment left Voldemort isolated, not only from others but from himself. He was trapped in a cycle of self-loathing and denial, unable to acknowledge the pain of his past or the emotional wounds that had shaped his life. His obsession with power became a defense mechanism, a way to distract himself from the emptiness inside. But this need for control eventually consumed him. The more Voldemort sought to dominate others, the more he pushed people away, reinforcing his belief that love was a weakness and only power could offer him protection. This constant need to control and dominate was not just a short-term survival tactic, it became the core of his identity. His inability to confront his vulnerability meant that he could never fully understand or embrace his own humanity. The consequences of this emotional repression were far-reaching. Voldemort's lack of emotional intelligence and self-awareness made him highly susceptible to manipulation and paranoia. He mistrusted everyone, including his closest followers, constantly fearing betrayal. This distrust eroded any sense of unity or loyalty within his ranks, leaving him increasingly isolated even within his own ranks. As Voldemort's emotional state deteriorated, his actions became more erratic and desperate. He grew more obsessed with immortality, not just to escape death but to avoid the emotional pain he had been running from his entire life. However, this obsession with immortality had its own consequences. In his pursuit of eternal life, Voldemort sacrificed his ability to experience true emotional connections, further reinforcing his belief that he was beyond redemption. His inability to connect with others also made him blind to the very people who could have been his allies. His obsession with power led him to alienate those who might have offered him the understanding and compassion he so desperately needed. The long-term effect of this emotional isolation was that Voldemort became a shell of a man, a hollow figure driven by fear and a desperate need for control. His inability to change or acknowledge his deep emotional wounds ultimately sealed his fate. Voldemort's psychological breakdown was not just the collapse of a dark wizard, it was the inevitable result of a lifetime spent rejecting the one thing that could have saved him, love. The emotional scars of his childhood never healed, and this lack of healing haunted him for the rest of his life. In the end, the consequences of Voldemort's actions were not just personal but global. His refusal to embrace love, his obsession with power, and his emotional isolation led to a world torn apart by fear, conflict, and hatred. Voldemort's story serves as a stark reminder of the dangers of rejecting vulnerability and the necessity of human connection for emotional well-being. Voldemort's journey is a painful reflection of feelings that many of us can relate to, feelings of abandonment, loneliness, and being misunderstood. As a child, he was abandoned by his mother and left in an orphanage, deprived of the love and security that most children need to thrive. This abandonment left a lasting mark on him, one that shaped his views on human connection and emotional vulnerability. For Voldemort, being alone meant survival. He learned early on that to care for someone or to be cared for was to open himself up to the possibility of being hurt, just as he had been hurt by his mother's neglect. His entire life became an attempt to avoid this pain. The emotional scars of his childhood made him believe that love was not only unnecessary but dangerous. He convinced himself that those who were loved were weak, and those who loved others were bound to be betrayed. This belief only grew stronger as he matured, and the loneliness he experienced was a constant companion. Voldemort's internal conflict was rooted in this deep loneliness. He craved connection, yet he couldn't allow himself to truly open up to others. This created an emotional rift within him. He could never understand why people like Harry Potter, who had been through so much, could still connect with others and form meaningful relationships. In Voldemort's eyes, Harry's ability to love and trust was a weakness, one that would eventually lead to his downfall. But what Voldemort failed to see was that this very vulnerability, the ability to love and be loved, was what made Harry strong. Voldemort's fear of being misunderstood also played a significant role in his emotional isolation. He feared that if he allowed others to see who he truly was, vulnerable, hurt, and human, he would be rejected. He became convinced that the only way to protect himself was to control everything and everyone around him, even if it meant alienating those closest to him. This constant need for control pushed him further into a world of isolation, where no one could truly understand him, and he couldn't understand anyone else. His fear of rejection, of being misunderstood, led him to build walls so high that no one could ever get close enough to truly know him. It was easier for Voldemort to push others away than to risk the possibility of being vulnerable and facing the rejection he feared so deeply. As he grew more powerful, he became more alone, surrounded by followers who feared him but could never truly connect with him. The more he distanced himself from others, the more his loneliness grew, until it became suffocating. It was a loneliness that no amount of power could ever fill. He had built his empire on fear, but fear could never provide the comfort or understanding that comes with love and acceptance. Voldemort's story is a tragic one that mirrors the struggles many of us face in dealing with abandonment, loneliness, and the fear of being misunderstood. His inability to confront these emotions and let love into his life led him down a path of isolation, where he was trapped in a cycle of fear, control, and emotional numbness. In the end, Voldemort's greatest tragedy wasn't his pursuit of power, it was his refusal to acknowledge the need for connection, for love, and for understanding. His story serves as a reminder of the importance of vulnerability, and how without it, we risk becoming disconnected from our own humanity. Voldemort's life was defined by a profound sense of emptiness that he could never escape. Despite his immense power, he was always trapped in a state of emotional isolation, never able to experience the one thing that could have given him purpose, love. His early years, marked by abandonment and neglect, laid the foundation for this emptiness. As a child, he was left without the nurturing care he needed, and this lack of connection shaped him into someone who could never fully bond with others. The emotional void in Voldemort's heart became his constant companion, and no matter how much power or fear he wielded, it could never fill the emptiness he felt inside. His obsession with control and domination was his way of coping with this overwhelming sense of nothingness. He thought that if he could control everything and everyone around him, he could create meaning in his life. But the more he grasped for power, the more isolated he became. Voldemort's relationships were shallow and devoid of genuine connection. He surrounded himself with followers who feared him, but no one truly loved him. He couldn't allow himself to be loved, nor could he understand why anyone would want to love him. The more he rejected love, the more he sank into his own loneliness. Voldemort's fear of vulnerability made him build walls so high that he isolated himself from the possibility of any real emotional connection. His loneliness was not just the absence of people, but the absence of meaningful relationships. He couldn't understand the bonds that others formed, like the deep friendships and love that Harry Potter shared with those around him. To Voldemort, these connections seemed like weaknesses, things that could only lead to pain and betrayal. As a result, he pushed away everyone who could have shown him compassion or affection, including those who were once close to him. The more he distanced himself from others, the more disconnected he became from his own humanity. The emptiness inside him grew deeper, and the more he tried to fill it with power, the more hollow he became. He had everything: immense magical abilities, a following of loyal followers, and the ability to manipulate the world around him, but he had nothing of real value. No love. No true connections. Just a void that nothing could satisfy. Voldemort's inner world was one of constant internal conflict. He longed for connection, yet his fear of it kept him isolated. He needed love but couldn't allow himself to receive it. He was trapped in a paradox, unable to escape the emptiness that consumed him. The more he tried to control the world around him, the more he lost touch with his own emotions, becoming a cold, detached figure. His inability to feel love or to connect with others turned him into a man who was not only feared by others but also profoundly alone. The state of emptiness that Voldemort lived in was a result of his refusal to confront his vulnerability and accept love. His heart, hardened by years of rejection and emotional trauma, was incapable of experiencing the warmth of human connection. And in the end, this emotional emptiness led to his downfall. Voldemort had spent his entire life seeking power to escape the pain of his past, but in doing so, he only deepened his own suffering. The more he rejected love, the more he became a hollow shell of a man, a figure consumed by his own fear and loneliness. His greatest tragedy wasn't that he failed to conquer the world, it was that he failed to conquer himself, to overcome the emptiness within, and to allow the one thing that could have saved him, love, into his life. Voldemort's story is a tragic journey, one marked by emotional scars that he could never heal. His inability to experience love, to understand what it meant to be cared for, became the central force that drove his every decision. From an early age, he was abandoned and left to navigate the world without the emotional support that most people take for granted. This void inside him became the foundation for everything he would later become, a figure feared by many, but deeply lonely and emotionally empty. His rejection of love was not born out of hatred, but out of fear. Voldemort believed that if he allowed himself to love or be loved, he would become weak, vulnerable to the pain that comes with connection. His mind, clouded by this fear, convinced him that the only way to survive in a world that had already shown him cruelty was to reject love completely. Power, he thought, was the only thing that could protect him from the heartache he feared so much. As Voldemort's journey unfolded, he gained everything he thought he wanted: immense power, control over others, and immortality. But in the process, he lost something far more valuable: his humanity. He became consumed by his obsession with control, unable to connect with those around him. The more he tried to distance himself from the possibility of love, the more isolated he became. His relationships were based on fear, not trust, and those closest to him were simply extensions of his power, not companions or friends. His heart, once capable of love as a child, was now a cold, impenetrable fortress. By the time he encountered Harry Potter, Voldemort's emotional state was already fragile. Harry, a symbol of everything Voldemort had rejected, represented the very thing Voldemort had been running from all his life: love. In Harry's presence, Voldemort was forced to confront the truth he had long avoided, that love is not a weakness, but a source of strength. However, Voldemort's fear of vulnerability kept him from embracing this truth. Instead of recognizing the power in connection, he saw only a threat to his carefully constructed world. The more he sought power, the more he grew detached from his own humanity. His emotional breakdown was inevitable. As he continued down his path of isolation, Voldemort's inability to understand love left him hollow. His greatest fear, rejection, came to pass in the most painful way. He pushed away those who might have been his allies, and in doing so, he alienated himself from the very source of healing and redemption. By the end, Voldemort's life was a testament to the dangers of rejecting love. His emotional emptiness consumed him, and no amount of power could fill the void he had created within himself. His fall was not just the result of his actions but of his inability to accept his own vulnerability. So, what does it mean to truly connect with others? Can we, like Voldemort, become so lost in our fear that we cut ourselves off from the very thing that could save us?